Maybe you've heard of the blood type diet, maybe you haven't. But in this video, all we're going to talk about is the O blood types.
They told you type O was just a blood type, just the simple one. But hidden in ancient DNA is a far darker truth. This was the blood that survived plagues cross continents, and may still carry the genetic scars of humanity's oldest war. Think type O is just a blood type. DNA shows a dark, centuries-old secret. Your ancestors were not just survivors. They were the greatest genetic warriors against history's deadliest diseases. For decades, doctors treated type O like the plain one. No frills, no story. Just the universal donor sitting quietly in the corner of every blood bank. But scientists who started digging into ancient genomes found something nobody expected. In parts of the Americas, indigenous communities do not just lean toward type O. They are almost entirely type O. Not 60%, not 80%. In some tribes, the number climbs past 99%. That is not a coincidence. That is not random chance spread across thousands of years. That is a signal proof of something that happened to an entire population, written directly into their blood. So what really happened? Why did one blood type take over an entire continent while the rest of the world stayed mixed? The answer touches plagues, ice age migrations, oceans nobody thought were crossed, and a secret some scientists are still arguing about today. And it starts with a mystery nobody saw coming. Stay here, because by the end of this, you will understand why type O might be the most important blood type in human history. Let's start simple, because the simple version is what most people think they know. Human blood comes in four main types: A, B, and O. The difference comes down to tiny markers called antigens sitting on the surface of your red blood cells. Think of them like ID badges. Type A wears the A badge. Type B wears the B badge. Type AB wears both. And type O, it wears nothing at all. No badge, no marker, completely blank. That blankness is exactly why O became known as the universal donor, because there is no A or B antigen for the immune system to react to. O blood can be given to almost anyone without causing a strong immune response. In an emergency room, when there is no time to test someone's blood type, doctors reach for O negative. It is the safest choice, the one that buys time when seconds matter. For most of the 20th century, that is where the story ended. O was useful. O was common. O was simple. Case closed. Except O is not supposed to be the default. Geneticists believe type O actually came from a mutation, a piece of genetic instructions that got deleted from the gene responsible for making the A and B antigens in the first place. In other words, O is not the original blood type. It is the glitch, the accident. And yet somehow that glitch did not just survive. In huge parts of the world, it took over completely. Globally, type O is the most common blood type, making up close to half the world population. That is already strange for something that started as a deletion. But it gets stranger. Travel to certain indigenous communities across the Americas, and that number does not stay anywhere close to half. It climbs to 90, then 95. In some tribes it comes close to 100. An entire population, almost all carrying a blood type that began as a mistake. That is not background noise in human genetics. That is a signal. And once researchers started asking why one continent looks so different from the rest of the world, they uncovered something most people have never heard. Nobody expected this. So, why does one continent look so different from the rest of the planet? To answer that, you have to zoom out and look at how blood types are spread across the globe. In Africa, where human life is believed to have begun, type O shows up at high rates, which is part of why some scientists think it might be one of the older forms still spreading widely. As populations moved into Europe and Asia, the picture changed. Type A became more common across Western Europe. Type B rose sharply through Central and Eastern Asia. The neat four-letter system started splitting unevenly across continents shaped by thousands of years of migration, disease, and isolation. Then there are the Americas, and this is where the pattern stops acting the way it should. Instead of a mix like Europe or Asia, indigenous populations show overwhelming, almost uniform type O in some communities, reaching frequencies most geneticists never see anywhere else on Earth. The leading theory goes back to the last ice age, when small groups of early humans crossed a land bridge connecting Siberia to Alaska. These founding populations were small, and many of them likely carried type O blood already. When a tiny group starts, an entire population, whatever traits they happen to carry, get passed forward to, multiplied across generations until they define the whole group. That alone might explain part of the story. But there is a second piece. Once those early migrants settled into the Americas, the continent became isolated. 2 oceans on either side meant almost no new genetic material flowed in for thousands of years. No new blood types drifted in to weaken the gene pool. No outside populations mixed in to balance it out. Type O simply had no competition. It became deeply rooted generation after generation until it defined entire nations of people. Compare that to other isolated populations around the world. Some Pacific islands show similarly uneven blood type frequencies for the same reason. Isolation locking in whatever genetic deck the founders happen to be given. But nowhere does the pattern run as deep or as steadily as it does across the Americas. Numbers like that do not show up by accident. So scientists went looking for proof, and decades of research have backed it up again and again. Researchers studying Native American populations across multiple communities have repeatedly found something almost unbelievable. In some groups tested, close to 99% of participants carried type O blood. Not a strong majority, not a clear trend. Nearly everyone in study after study, long before anyone could even sequence a genome properly. And it was not limited to one region. Similar numbers turned up everywhere. Researchers looked from indigenous communities in the snowy parts of Canada down to groups living deep in the Amazon rainforest. Different climates, different diets, different languages, completely different environments, and yet the same blood type dominating again and again. So what was really happening? The leading explanation comes down to natural selection working exactly the way it is supposed to over thousands of years. Early populations crossing into the Americas faced brutal conditions, harsh climates, unfamiliar pathogens, and constant physical demands just to survive long enough to reproduce. In places like that, even a small biological advantage can grow fast. If type O blood offered even a small edge against the infections and diseases spreading at the time, the people who carried it would have been more likely to survive, more likely to have children, and more likely to pass that same blood type down. Repeat that pattern across hundreds of generations, and a once random genetic trait stops looking random at all. It starts looking unavoidable. This is the part most people miss when they hear type O is common. Common does not mean ordinary. In the Americas, common means selected, chosen, generation after generation by forces invisible to the people carrying it. Their bodies were quietly fighting battles they never knew about. and the survivors passed the proof forward in their blood. Modern DNA analysis has only confirmed what decades of blood type research first hinted at. This was not drift. It was not coincidence. It was survival written into the genome of an entire continent, one generation at a time. But survival pressure was not the same everywhere. And that is where the story gets even more specific. Take the Andes, where some indigenous populations have lived at extreme altitude for thousands of years, breathing air with a fraction of the oxygen found at sea level. Their bodies adapted in remarkable ways over generations, and researchers noticed something curious hiding under those adaptations: a striking number of high-altitude indigenous communities carry type O blood. It is a debated theory, but here is the idea. Some researchers suggest type O blood may flow a little more easily through narrow vessels, possibly helping oxygen reach tissues, though this is not widely accepted in mainstream hematology and remains unproven. At sea level, any difference would barely matter. At 12,000 feet, supporters argue it might matter more. It is a small, uncertain biological change with a possible benefit in exactly the kind of environment where these populations settled. Then there is disease. Historical records suggest that people carrying A or B antigens were hit harder by certain infections because some pathogens are built to latch onto those exact molecular markers, like A key fitting a lock. Type O lacking both simply does not offer that same foothold. While malaria was not a major threat in pre-Columbian America the way it was in Africa, the broader idea still applies. Fewer molecular targets for pathogens to use means fewer ways for disease to spread through a population. Diet adds another layer, though a much shakier one. Indigenous communities ate very different foods, depending on where they lived. From seafood-heavy diets along the Pacific coast to corn-based diets across Mesoamerica. Some have guessed that type O metabolism might handle high-protein, high-fat diets differently, an idea that echoes the popular blood type diet and one most nutrition scientists consider unproven. And then there is the social piece, easy to miss, but impossible to ignore. In small, tightly connected communities, a person whose blood could save almost anyone during childbirth or injury was not just lucky, they were valuable. That kind of value does not just save lives in the moment. Over generations, it can quietly shape who survives, who thrives, and whose genes get passed forward. Before I show you the last part, if you have ever looked at your own results and wondered where this ancient type O bloodline fits into your ancestry, I put it all together in a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. If the fossil record and old blood tests gave us the outline of this story, modern DNA technology is what is finally filling in the details. Over the last 2 decades, genetic testing has become precise enough to trace bloodlines back through specific tribes, specific regions, even specific historical figures, something that would have sounded like science fiction not long ago. One of the clearest examples involves a direct descendant of Sitting Bull. Using DNA testing, researchers confirmed a genetic connection linking a living relative directly to one of the most important figures in Native American history, closing a gap that family stories alone had never been able to fully prove. For descendants of indigenous peoples, this kind of confirmation means something much bigger than just satisfying curiosity. For generations, colonization disrupted records, broke up families, and in many cases purposely cut people off from their tribal histories. DNA testing has become one of the few tools able to reconnect some of those broken threads, offering a way back to ancestors, languages, and communities that history tried to erase. It is not just about identity in the abstract either. For many indigenous people, proving ancestry through DNA can affect access to tribal recognition, resources, and rights tied directly to heritage. A genetic test is not just a curiosity purchase in these cases. It can be the difference between being officially recognized as part of a community or being shut out of it completely. But this power comes with real tension attached. The same DNA data that reconnects people to their roots can also be bought, sold, and stored by private companies with their own business interests. Questions about consent, privacy, and who actually controls this information have become some of the most debated issues in the entire field. Treating someone's genetic heritage like a product to be packaged and sold sits uneasily next to its deeper purpose, helping people understand who they are and where they came from. Scientists working in this space increasingly argue that, done responsibly with indigenous communities involved in how their own data gets used, this technology becomes something rare, a tool that can heal historical wounds instead of making them deeper. Some DNA results do not just confirm a family tree, they spark real debate about what scientists thought they knew about an entire continent. That is exactly what happened with a man named Crawford, living on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation in Montana, one of the largest Native American reservations in the country. When a commercial DNA testing company studied his ancestry, the results went far beyond a typical family history report. Though, it is worth noting this was not a peer-reviewed academic study. The company's findings suggested an unusually deep genetic timeline, a claim that remains debated among archaeologists and has not been confirmed by mainstream research. For decades, the main theory was simple. Small groups crossed a land bridge from Siberia into Alaska, then spread south over generations. If Crawford's commercial test results hold up to careful study, they would complicate that timeline, adding fuel to a growing argument among some researchers that the real story might be older, messier, and far less straight than the textbook version suggests. And the deeper scientists dig into ancient genomes, the stranger the picture gets. Take Neanderthals and Denisovans, two ancient human groups long dismissed as primitive evolutionary dead ends. Genetic analysis tells a very different story. Both groups share enough similarities with modern humans that some researchers argue they should be considered close relatives rather than separate, lesser species. Archaeological evidence supports this. 2. Showing complex toolmaking, artistic expression, and even symbolic behavior among Neanderthals, abilities once thought to belong only to modern humans. And here is the detail that changes everything. Many people alive today carry traces of Neanderthal DNA in their genomes, proof that these groups did not simply disappear. They interbred, mixed, and left fingerprints still visible in human genetics tens of thousands of years later. Then there is Lake Baikal in Siberia, the oldest and deepest freshwater lake on Earth, sitting at the center of an ancient migration story most people have never heard. For thousands of years, this single place served as a genetic crossroads where populations from the east and west met, mixed, and shared DNA long before anyone wrote any of it down. Some researchers believe the ancestors of Native Americans passed directly through this exact region on their way toward a continent nobody had ever stepped on before. But the strangest discovery might be the one nobody saw coming at all. Proof that indigenous Americans had contact with people from across the open Pacific, centuries before European contact. Genetic evidence shows that Polynesians and Native Americans interacted roughly 800 years ago, an encounter that left clear traces still detectable in DNA. Today, this is not a small claim. It means someone somewhere crossed thousands of miles of open ocean and met people who had never seen them coming. The clues had actually been sitting in plain sight for a long time. Sweet potatoes and bottle gourds, crops native to the Americas, show up in Polynesian archaeological sites with no other explanation. For years, that evidence sparked fierce debate, with many scientists dismissing it as coincidence or contamination. But newer genetic studies changed the conversation. Researchers found shared DNA segments across multiple Polynesian islands, all tracing back to the same indigenous American source, evidence of real intermarriage, not random chance. Using computer techniques, scientists even trace that ancestry to a specific region in what is now Colombia. And this connects to a bigger question still not settled. How did people actually first reach the Americas? The land bridge theory remains the main explanation, but it is far from the only one being discussed. Some researchers argue for a coastal route, following the shoreline by boat rather than walking overland. Others raise the possibility of travel across polar ice. And many indigenous nations, including the Navajo, hold their own origin stories, accounts describing peoples who were always present on this land, not arrivals from somewhere else. Science has not settled that question, and it may never fully agree on a single answer. What it has settled is this: Type O blood is not a footnote in any of these stories. It is tied to migrations across oceans, survival through plagues, adaptation to altitude, and connections between continents nobody expected to find linked at all. And it is still doing exactly what it always has. Right now, in hospitals, everywhere, Type O blood is being given to patients who have no idea their lifeline traces back through every twist of this story. So, the next time someone tells you Type O is just the simple universal blood type, you will know better. It is not blank. It is not boring. It is a record written in molecules instead of words of ice age, crossings, plague survived, mountains adapted to, and oceans somehow crossed by people. Almost forgot to mention, for millions of indigenous people across the Americas, that record is not abstract. It is running through their veins right now, the same way it ran through the veins of ancestors who made it through conditions most of us can barely imagine. Science still does not have every answer. How exactly humans first reached this continent? Why Type O won out so completely? What really happened on those Pacific shores 8 centuries ago? These questions are still being argued over in labs and journals today. But one thing is not up for debate. This blood type carried people through history's hardest moments, and it is still quietly doing the same job in hospitals right now, long after anyone remembers why it mattered in the first place. If you are Type O, you are not carrying a footnote. You are carrying a survival story centuries in the making. Which part of this surprised you the most? Drop it in the comments.